here with Jim DiEugenio. He's the author of The JFK Assassination, The Evidence Today, and the publisher of KennedysandKing.com. He's written a 4-part article on the Kennedys and civil rights. In part 3, Jim gets into the Kennedys' role in tearing down Jim Crow. So, Jim, why don't you start? You talked us through the Eisenhower years and how Eisenhower basically didn't do anything. So what did Kennedy find himself dealing with in 1961?
Okay, there's two big myths that are very prevalent in the mainstream media about JFK and civil rights. They are, number one, that Kennedy waited, to get involved with this cause, all right? And number two, like Van Jones said, the Kennedys had to be educated about the issue. Neither of those are true. And all you have to do is examine the record, all right? And in fact, what happened is that on the very first day, in other words, during his inauguration, JFK was looking at the parade, and he said, you know something? I don't see enough black faces out there, specifically in the Coast Guard, Color Guard. And so that night, he calls up his Treasury Secretary and says, I want to do something about this I see as a problem at the Coast Guard. There's not enough people of color. So why don't you get me a report on that, and then we'll find a way to solve the problem. Now, why is that important? Because that was the beginning of the term affirmative action. See, almost nobody knows that it was President Kennedy who started that whole phrase, affirmative action. All right. Now, what did he mean by that? Okay, he meant it in its purest sense. That is, we have to find people. We have to recruit people. And it's not like we're going to bend over backward just to let them in just because, they're a different color. We're going to find qualified people. They're out there, but they don't have the chance that Caucasian people do have. Right. They don't have the opportunity. All right? So, and believe me, this is incredible. The next year, the Coast Guard Academy sent certain representatives to 199 high schools throughout the United States. They interviewed, they addressed crowds that totaled 11,000 people, and then they did interviews with 561 of them. And that's how he broke down that whole, wall of segregation in the Coast Guard Academy. Now, this carried over to his first cabinet meeting, because he put two and two together. Well, if it's like that over there, it's probably like that over here too. So, right. And he said, I want a report from each department, like Justice, Agriculture, all right, the Treasury, etc. And I want to know how many employees you have and how many of them are African American. So at the next meeting, he got the results back. I'll give you one example. The Justice Department had over 1,700 lawyers. 19 were black. Let me say that again. 1,700 lawyers, 19 were black. Now, is that terrible or is that terrible? I bet you figured out that's less than 1%. Okay? And so that's when JFK began to ride herd on these guys and said, I want you guys to start looking for people. I want you to find people because I'm going to bring this up at every meeting. And I want to see some results. All right? And then what he did is he assigned a civil service officer to each department to keep track of their progress. And then he signed another officer to get them to recruit at places like historically black colleges, like Texas A&I or Grambling, places like that. And so year by year, the numbers went up. All right? Now, that wasn't all. See, The United States government is one of the biggest contractors in America. You know, like the State Department, they need things like pens, pencils, erasers, briefcases, etc. Literally hundreds of them, maybe thousands.
Sure.
Of course, there's NASA, and then there's the biggest one of all is probably the Pentagon. All right, and so they have to contract out for things like, like for example, they need a lot of uniforms in the Pentagon, and so they get the textile, they contract out with a textile company that we want 500 yards of this and we want 1,000 yards of this, etc. And they go ahead and they give it to a tailor and they make the uniforms. All right, so Kennedy began to ride herd on that also. We are not going to be dealing with any companies who are segregated. They're either going to integrate or we're not going to do business with them. And this is, by the way, this is how he began to break the back of segregation in the South. Because places like, for example, North Carolina, Virginia, South, those are very big textile states because they grow a lot of cotton. Okay? And so for the first time, you now had African American workers working at different levels of those textile companies. And they interviewed one guy and they said, look, we have to do this or we're going to lose the contracts and we're going to go bankrupt. All right? So that's another way he did it. Another way he did, and then he began to integrate colleges in the South because that's another place where they rely on federal government contracts and grants. And in fact, it's the lifeblood of a lot of those private universities. All right? And so John F. Kennedy, he was the first guy who demanded changes in admissions policies. In other words, it wasn't just the people who were going to handle the money once they handed over. He demanded changes in the admissions policies. I want you guys to show me that you're admitting people of color in this college. And this has been unheard of, in the South. But places like Duke, a private college, like Duke and Rice University now began to have to admit African American people. So this was so big, such a switch from Eisenhower, that it was really, kind of a quantum leap forward, because Eisenhower not only did very little at Little Rock, he let those kids stand out there, with those hecklers and those National Guard people for 22 days, but he also failed to join the NAACP in the Arthur and Lucy case. That was a case where the NAACP tried to integrate the University of Alabama in 1956. All right? Eisenhower did not back the court order, did not escort her to and from classes, did not send in the National Guard when there began to be demonstrations. He literally let her be run right off the campus. And I'm not exaggerating very much at all. All right? And so because of that, that kind of non-action, they encouraged these guys. And, of course, it made it harder for Kennedy. All right? It encouraged these guys, these power brokers in the South, to go ahead and rail against the Brown versus Board decision. Like James Eastland made a speech, quote, "You are not required to obey any court which passes such a ruling. In fact, you are obligated to defy it."
About integration.
About integration, yeah. Integrating schools and colleges. All right. And so, see, I think Eisenhower did this because he did fairly well in the South in the 1952 election, and he did even better in the 1956 election. All right. So it didn't matter to him that, Charles Houston and Thurgood Marshall had closed in on Plessy versus Ferguson. All right. But, and Brown versus Board went ahead and reversed that. But the Supreme Court in 1955, they restated the 1954 decision because they felt the South was going to try and get around the decision by essentially creating better separate schools. Because the separate schools they had before were pretty awful. They spent much less money on them, and the kids were so disappointed they actually rioted in Virginia about how bad this. So now they decided to build better schools so they could be actually try and say they were separate but equal. All right. So the Supreme Court said no. In 1985, we're not going to accept that. We want the schools to be integrated. Now, since Kennedy had been on record, all right, with the Brown versus Board decision, all right, then he was not going to go ahead and follow in what Eisenhower did. And by the way, if you think the Arthur and Lucy case was bad, in 1956, there was a court order to integrate Black American students at a high school in Texas called Mansfield High. The governor called out the Texas Rangers to stop the African American kids from registering. Mm-hmm. And Eisenhower didn't do anything. Mm. I mean, isn't that incredible? I mean, he's actually letting the states go ahead and localities overrule the Supreme Court. Yeah. Now, in Virginia was really pretty bad because that was led by Senator Harry Byrd, who had a very strong machine in that state. And the Richmond newspaper featured a guy named James Kilpatrick, who made his whole reputation and career denouncing the Brown versus Board decision. He was a close friend of William F. Buckley. All right? And so they did everything they could, all right, in order to go ahead and not obey Brown versus Board. They were even seriously thinking of dropping the whole idea of state education and going ahead and making every school into a private school and excluding African American kids. And they actually did that in Prince Edward County. There were 1,800 African American students who did not have schools to attend. Because, you know, so what I'm saying, of course, is this. Rather than integrate, they would rather see those kids not even go to school at all. That's how bad it was. All right? And Eisenhower encouraged that by saying, can you believe a president of the United States saying this? States were not required to maintain a system of public education, and therefore the president was powerless to take any action. See, one of the things I've learned doing all the research on this, I've really changed my mind about Dwight Eisenhower. Okay, he really was not a good. The only way you can say he's a good president is if you compare him to somebody like Trump or George W. Bush. He was not a good president. Okay, by any way, shape, or form. All right. Well, when JFK comes in, Bobby Kennedy and he decide that right off the bat, okay, we are not going to back this decision by the Prince Edward County's Board of Supervisors. Bobby Kennedy calls Prince Edward, quote, a blight on Virginia and a disgrace to our educational system and to our country. Now, isn't that what a president should be saying, or an attorney general? All right. And Kennedy now began to remake the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. See, I think the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals was a very good court for the Brown decision in the southern part of the United States, the Deep South. The Fourth Circuit was not that good. That dealt with the Upper South. But JFK began to remake the court when a couple of people stepped down, and there was an act to add judges, I think in 60 or 61, add judges to circuit courts. And Kennedy began to appoint guys who he thought would be more in sync with the way he thought that the Brown versus Board decision should be interpreted. All right? Now, that took a while, though. All right? In the meantime, the White House does something that, to my knowledge, and by the way, see, and this is what I mean. this is night and day between Eisenhower and Kennedy on this issue. He did something that I think is pretty much unprecedented. Okay? He essentially told Burke Marshall and Bobby Kennedy, okay, that we're going to do something about this, and I want to make it a very high priority. All right, I don't want those kids to be out of school any longer. So Bobby Kennedy went to a friend of his, William Vanden Heuvel, all right, and he told him, we're going to start up a school district from scratch in Prince Edward. Do you believe that? That's what he did. So Vanden Heuvel went around. He went to these foundations. He raised $1.2 million. Okay? And that's what they did. They started a whole school system from grade school to high school from scratch. All right? And also something else that Eisenhower did not do his entire term of office, 2 terms. The Justice Department joined the lawsuit by the NAACP against Prince Edward, not as a friend of the court, what they call amicus curiae, but as a plaintiff. All right? In other words, they were actually going to join, and they were actually going to present evidence. They were actually going to bring their own lawyers into court, etc. All right? Now, the same thing happens in New Orleans. The New Orleans School District has pretty much the same reaction, the Brown versus Board, as Virginia. And so they began to make all these excuses and all these schemes to find a way not to have integrated schools in the South. But then finally, Judge Skelly Wright ordered integration to proceed in September of 1960. And so now what happens is a state legislature passed laws circumventing Wright's order. What does the Eisenhower administration do? They say, Judge Wright, do not overrule these state laws until after the election. Right? Because they didn't want to deal with another Little Rock. Well, Eisenhower was still in office. All right? So now, because Wright didn't do anything for a while, the state legislature passed laws to oust school board members and to even fire teachers who agreed to work with Black American students. Do you believe this stuff? You know, and the thing is, it wasn't that I was still alive. I was alive back then. I didn't know this stuff was going on. All right? Well, Wright, of course, then went ahead and struck those down. All right? And then he asked for federal marshals to escort the African American students to their new schools. So what happens next? They do the same thing in New Orleans that Orville Faubus and the Caucasian parents did in Little Rock. They yanked all the white kids out of the schools. And so there's a famous case, and we have the picture here. Ruby Bridges she was in grammar school. She was literally the only student in the whole school. There's something like 30 teachers. She was the only student in the whole school. All right.
It's an incredible photograph. I'll put it in the slideshow.
Yeah. And the reason he needed marshals is, and I have the other photograph, look what's happening across the street. He needed policemen, because there were that many violent demonstrators there. All right. So as in Virginia now, the legislature threatens to close down the schools. And they begin to withhold funds. All right. So now Skelly Wright calls Burke Marshall, and Burke Marshall tells Bobby Kennedy about the problem, and the Attorney General famously replied, sort of like Malcolm X, quote, "We'll have to do whatever is necessary," unquote. And so again, the Kennedy administration does something that Eisenhower never did, and I don't think ever contemplated doing, okay? In February of 1961, and remember, David, this is less than a month after JFK's inauguration. Less than a month. So these people who say JFK dawdled, and this is a bunch of baloney. All right, on the first day he's going affirmative action. In the second month, he's going ahead, and Burke Marshall now announces he's going to be filing charges against the State Secretary of Education, Shelby Jackson. In other words, he's going to indict this guy. All right? And so Marshall's aim was to block the attempt by the governor to cut off funding for integrated schools. Wright set a trial date to begin the proceedings against the secretary for contempt of court, and Jackson backed off, discretion, the better part of valor, and said he would not interfere any longer, and he avoided the prison sentence by pleading he had a weak heart. Okay? Now, in almost none of these books that I'm reviewing here, this includes Stephen Levingston's book, Kennedy and King, David Margolick's book, The Promise and the Dream, and What Truth Sounds Like by Michael Dyson.
Right.
I don't remember any mention of those in those three books of this case. I think it's a very important demonstration that, number one, King was not the focus of civil rights, because the Kennedys did this on their own. Okay? And on top of that, they did not have to wait. There was no pleading or anything. This is right out the gate. All right? So, see, they knew what they were going to do. All right? The minute they got into the White House on the issue. It's not like they were alien to it or anything like that.
Right.
All right? So then Bobby Kennedy goes to the University of Georgia Law Day on May the 6th, 1961. The first time anybody can remember that an attorney general ever went into the South, all right, and addressed the civil rights issue. And he wanted to do this because he very much appreciated that this had been done through the efforts of the Fifth Circuit Court in the South, all right, which we'll get to how important they are later. And he spent half his address talking about civil rights. We have a link to it here in my article. And these are just, these early moves are essentially fulfillments of JFK's promise that, unlike what these guys write, Kennedy did address a civil rights issue in the 1960 election. All right, and I have an excerpt here from one speech that he did November the 1st, 1960 in L.A. And he compared his record on that issue versus Nixon's record on the issue, and this was essentially him saying that if you elect me, things are going to change. We're not going to do what Eisenhower and Nixon did. So the next thing that happens is that Bobby Kennedy then petitions the Interstate Commerce Commission as a result of the Freedom Rides earlier that year, and to implement the Supreme Court decision to go ahead and integrate the interstate busing and terminals. And by about the end of the next year, this was done. Okay? By the end of the next year, it was done. Okay? And another blow against Jim Crow. Now, African-American people can board buses anywhere they want to and go anywhere they want to and not be segregated at bus terminals. All right? Now, another thing the Kennedys wanted to do is that they wanted to go ahead and this is very relevant for today, they wanted to go ahead and file lawsuits in court based on voting discrimination. In fact, on the day Bobby Kennedy was confirmed as Attorney General, James Eastland of Mississippi reminded him that the previous administration had never filed a voting rights lawsuit in Mississippi in 8 years, which was true, a little bit of an understatement, because the Eisenhower administration only filed 10 voting discrimination lawsuits in 8 years, and 2 of those were on the last day. So if you exclude those, they did 1 a year. And then after he was confirmed, JFK writes him a note saying, quote, "Get the road maps and go," unquote. Now, again, This is just a few weeks after being inaugurated.
Hmm.
All right? All right, so and that meant, of course, get your lawyers together, start going ahead into the backwoods and valleys of the South, and start filing, get the information, and start filing the lawsuits. In 1 year, Bobby Kennedy doubled the amount of lawyers in the civil rights section. In that 1 year, he doubled the amount, I'm going to say this very slowly and clearly, he doubled the amount of cases that Eisenhower had filed in 2 full terms.
Mm.
Okay? By 1963, the number of attorneys in the civil rights section had quintupled. All right? He then hired 18 legal interns to search the microfilm records in every suspect district, and just that opened up 61 new investigations in 1 year. All right? Prior to JFK, it's very clear the Brown decision nor the strictures of the Civil Rights Commission were being obeyed. And to increase the tempo, Bobby Kennedy went from suing districts and counties to filing against entire states or regions of states. All right? And JFK was very interested in this, and so Bobby Kennedy sent him reports every month, and then he sent him a yearly report, and at the bottom of the 1962 report, JFK wrote, keep pushing these cases. But one of the big problems was because of what happened before. Because Eisenhower and Nixon have done next to nothing. You know, it created a very big hill to climb. So when John Doerr, a very famous civil rights lawyer, attempted to interview people in Tennessee, he found that in 13 counties, not one single Black American was registered to vote. All right, and so he tried to talk to these people, but then some of the people he talked to show how bad these people were in the South, were then evicted from their lands as tenant farmers. And so Doerr had to call up Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy calls the White House, and then JFK has to organize an effort to send aid to those people who've been evicted. That's how bad it was.
Wow.
And I blame the previous administrations on this, you know. Now, another thing that they tried to do was something called the voter registration drive. All right, which, again, this had never been done before. All right, it was a big job because, I'll give you another example. In East Carroll in northeast Louisiana, there were more African Americans of voting age than whites, but there were 2,485 whites registered to vote and not one single African American. Let me say that again. 2,845 whites and not one single African American, even though there were more Black Americans and white Americans in that county. That's how bad it was. All right? In another parish in Louisiana, in Bienville, almost every single white voter is registered. Of over 4,000 African Americans, 25 were registered. All right? Now, the problem is that this is expensive, because you got to send people out in this terribly hot weather in the South. They have to knock on doors. They have to collect information, you know, and it's not an easy job to do. So what happened is that the Kennedys sent Burke Marshall and Harris Walford, who was a civil rights assistant, to foundations in the North to get the money. They ended up collecting $870,000, which would be about $7 million today, and they parceled it out to the NAACP, CORE, and the SCLC, and they called that the Voter Education Project, and it lasted until 1964. You know, as one commentator noted, it gained an increase in its short duration that would have taken 10 years to achieve under normal conditions, and it moved the whole question of Negro voter registration off dead center where it had been for a decade. It established momentum. All right? If you can believe it, RFK actually got the FBI to help in these cases, which had to be really terrible thing for J. Edgar Hoover. He must not have liked doing it, all right? And so they did a lot of this extensive research and voting rights abuses, and then they presented it to the judges of the Fifth Circuit, okay? Now, this is an issue, the Fifth Circuit, that these books do not mention. That's how bad they are. See, the Fifth Circuit Court, this was how unusual it was. The majority of judges on that court believed in the Brown versus Board decision. And they believed that African Americans should have equal rights, which is very unusual. Okay, I think there were 9 judges on that circuit, 9 or 11. And I think about 6 or 7 of them believed in what Bobby Kennedy was doing and what JFK was doing. And so with that court in alliance with him, all right, they began to present the evidence for this voting discrimination, okay, in the South. And incredibly, they started winning, okay, with the help of this Judge Minor Wisdom. Bobby Kennedy got the voting test for interpretation of the Constitution thrown out in 1/3 of the entire state of Louisiana, all right, in one case. It was Frank Johnson, another judge, who actually made the cover of Time magazine, when we have that picture up here, and who had worked with Bobby Kennedy on the Freedom Riders case, who gave him his first win in a voting rights case. And with that decision, the number of registered African American voters went from 13% to 42% in Macon County, Alabama. As Judge Johnson later said to his biographer, the Macon County case was the one that began to erode Southern voting discrimination. The Middle District of Alabama Federal Court took the lead in voting rights, and the Fifth Circuit and the Supreme Court upheld those rulings. When the Selma demonstrations began in 1965, the black citizens in my section of the state of Alabama had already won the right to vote. All right. So using the Fifth Circuit, Bobby Kennedy had planned on eradicating the problem by 1968. The Selma demonstration, hurried it up a lot by about 3 years, because it then became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. All right. Now, Bobby Kennedy and JFK tried to get a voting rights bill through Congress in 1962. Now, you can believe this, but it's true. Eisenhower called a press conference and labeled their modest proposal for voting rights, quote, unconstitutional. Do you believe that?
In 1962 he did that, so after his presidency came...
He wasn't even president anymore.
Yeah.
But he called a press conference and said, giving black people the right to vote is unconstitutional. Well, he didn't say that, of course, but he said the act was unconstitutional.
All right.
That's what I mean. I completely reevaluated Eisenhower after doing the research. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned this, but he tried to talk Earl Warren out of ruling for the defendants in the Brown versus Board case. Isn't that incredible? All right. Okay, now, but in 62, when they tried to get this thing through, they couldn't break the Southern filibuster. It was still too strong. But it did help inspire the 1962 effort to start a poll tax amendment. And the 24th Amendment outlawing the poll tax was ratified in January of 1964. All right, so that's what that accomplished. It eliminated the poll tax. All right. Now, what happens next is that JFK now begins to consult with his buddy John Kenneth Galbraith, and says, I think what we should do is make it a point that we're not going to join any segregated clubs in the area. So he got John Kenneth Galbraith to sponsor him at 2 exclusive clubs in the area, all right, and the Metropolitan and the Cosmos Club. And then JFK withdrew his membership application when they would not wait on African American people. He then called a press conference and announced that neither he nor any member of his administration would attend functions at segregated facilities. All right, so both those clubs then integrated, and then members of his administration started a new club, okay, non-discriminatory, called the Federal City Club. All right. Now, Harry Truman could not continue the FEPC, the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which was set up during World War II, in order to make sure that, as I mentioned earlier, that all of these contracting agencies with the federal government were hiring under non-discriminatory methods. Well, Kennedy started something called the CEEO, okay? And that was pretty much the same thing, Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity. And that ended up being pretty effective, and Bobby Kennedy filed a couple of lawsuits, and including against Lockheed, and that was a very big employer in Georgia. And so he made them go ahead and integrate. And this eventually turned into a permanent part of the government, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is still around. So in other words, Kennedy did what Harry Truman could not do, and what Eisenhower and Nixon simply were not interested in, by getting the federal government on board with that. All right. Now, some people say that, well, like for example, Paul Street, who I've clashed with on Kennedy's a couple of times, that Kennedys did not protect civil rights workers in the South. All right. So this was an issue that Burke Marshall, Kennedy's assistant, who got sick and tired of hearing this, actually wrote a book about in 1964. It's called Federalism and Civil Rights. He got tired of explaining to people, the United States does not have a federal police force. The FBI is an investigatory. It's about 90% of its power is investigatory, okay? And so the federal government cannot go in and arrest people like Bull Connor, okay, especially in 1963. Because in 1963, Bull Connor was actually obeying the laws of Birmingham on the local and state level. So on what pretense can I go in and do something like that?
Right.
All right, okay? And so there is an exception to the law, though, as Carl Brower in his fine book, John F. Kennedy, the Second Reconstruction, notes that when there is, it's called the insurrection law. When there is a general breakdown in civil order, all right, then you have the right to do it. And so that's what JFK did. Bobby Kennedy did it during the Freedom Riders demonstration. And as we'll see, JFK is going to utilize that in the Ole Miss riot, okay? But as every legal scholar has noted, it's not something that the government should use as a permanent device. It's something from, as Alexander Bickel said, we should actually recoil from, because it's destructive of a free society. In other words, we don't want a Gestapo in the United States, all right? All right, and so that explains away that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Kennedy managed to integrate some private universities in the South by withdrawing funds from them. And then he managed to get Clemson and South Carolina integrated peacefully also. So that was another blow against Jim Crow. All right. And so, but the University of Mississippi presented a very serious problem. James Meredith famously applied there the day after JFK's inauguration. Well, to put it mildly, they didn't want him to come. All right. And so when they overruled his application, the Fifth Circuit stepped in and overruled the trustees. Then the trustees went ahead and turned over authority to the governor of the state, Ross Barnett. So JFK now sees there's going to be some problems, and he begins to arrange a force of both federal marshals and regular Army troops at Millington Air Base in Memphis. Well, to make a long story short, Ross Barnett ended up double-crossing the White House, and his stalling tactics allowed a group variously estimated from 2,000 to 3,000 demonstrators on the campus, and he deliberately pulled the police force there before Nicholas Katzenbach got there with Meredith on a Sunday night. They were supposed to register him on a Monday morning. Mm. And what happened, of course, was a famous General Walker-led, some people call it an insurrection, because the federal marshals were outnumbered by the demonstrators. Burke Marshall saying, and I think 600 marshals. And like I said, there were between 2,000 and 3,000 demonstrators. And it ended up being a mess. And Katzenbach's communication network broke down. If you can believe it, he had to run to a payphone to start calling. Out of a Dr. Strangelove, call the White House on a payphone, you know. And so the Army didn't get there to something like 2 or 3 hours after they were scheduled to be there. So it ended up being a real mess. You know, you had 2 people killed, scores of marshals were injured, 13 men were indicted.
Oh, wow.
All right? And so President Kennedy was so worried about this that the entire time Meredith was at the University of Mississippi, he had 2 security guards escorting him to and from class and guarding his dorm room. You know, he was determined that nothing was going to happen to this guy. Mm. Now, at the University of Alabama in '63, things went smoother, all right? And this was the famous confrontation between George Wallace and Nicholas Katzenbach. And there's actually films of this, all right? And unlike what some people say, you know, like some very questionable writers on the Kennedy administration, all right, have said that this was supposedly, you know, like Evan Thomas, for example, that this was a completely choreographed event. It was not, because Bobby Kennedy had tried to talk to Wallace. He actually went down to the governor's mansion, and they got no headway. President Kennedy tried to talk to Wallace, got nowhere. All right, they didn't know what he was going to do, and so what happens is that Judge Seaborn Lynn, who's another friend of Frank Johnson's on the Fifth Circuit, wrote an order that 2 African-American students were to enter the university. All right. Wallace assembled a force of 895 state troopers and police to back him. So JFK sent in 3,000 troops. This time they were only just a few minutes away. All right. So Bobby Kennedy, there's a famous film by Robert Drew called Crisis, in which they record the meetings of this in the White House. Mm. See, Bobby Kennedy thought that they might have to force the students through the front door. He said, there's a far-in door, he says, during the movie, that we might be able to shove the kids through, away from Wallace, to get them in. All right? Well, thank God it didn't happen, because I think, according to Andrew Cohen's book, 2 Days in June, which is a kind of microanalysis of the whole thing, all right, Katzenbach and Wallace finally came to an agreement that morning, okay, that morning, all right? But you know why, by the way? Because the judge, Seaborn Lynn, had threatened to indict Wallace if he blocked the entry of the kids into the school, all right? That's what I mean. That's why they were so important, all right? Okay, so that evening, once the kids are admitted, President Kennedy, of course, gave what many people believe to be the finest speech given on civil rights since Abraham Lincoln, all right? But if you can believe it, that wasn't the end of George Wallace. See, Judge Frank Johnson had written an order for 3 high schools in North Alabama to be integrated with a number of African American students. All right? On that day they were supposed to go to class. The state troopers arrived awaiting them, blocked their entry, and Wallace sent a message to the superintendent that the school would not open that day. You believe this guy? Bobby Kennedy now convenes, he goes to the Fifth Circuit Court, all right, convenes a 5-man panel to issue a restraining order stopping Wallace from interfering with the integration of the schools. Wallace tries to get around the restraining order by now sending the National Guard to stop the students from entering. That afternoon, JFK ordered the National Guard, the state National Guard, to be nationalized, that is placed under control, and finally the kids were allowed to go to school.
Hmm.
Isn't this some really bizarre stuff?
Let me ask you something. Oh, it's totally bizarre. These are just people trying to go to school. It's we see a lot of strange stuff happening now, but thank God none of it is this crazy. But what kind of you talked a couple times about the Kennedys were going to try to indict that the guy running the Board of Education, and then Wallace. Was this kind of using the 14th Amendment to charge them? What kind of laws were they trying to use to bring these guys to order?
Yeah, that's what they were going to use. They were going to use the Civil War amendments, okay, to bring them up on charges of being in contempt of court, because that's what the Fifth Circuit was using to open up these schools. Was the Civil War amendments. To these guys, they were not going to pay any attention to those the Supreme Court decisions that tried to eliminate, okay, which we talked about in the first part. Okay, to them, the amendments, because they were actually part of the Constitution, took priority.
Right.
All right, and that's what they were going to use. All right, in order to get them indicted for trying to obstruct justice.
Okay.
Right.
I see.
Now, in addition to relying upon those Civil War amendments, the other thing that the Fifth Circuit relied upon for their rulings was the Brown versus Board case of 1954. And they tried to apply that as liberally as they could and to stretch it as far as they could. All right. So the combination of that superseding decision, which eclipsed Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that allowed them to prioritize and go back to the Civil War amendments 13th, 14th, and 15th, and then begin to rule in favor of what Bobby Kennedy wanted. And by the way, I should add, Bobby Kennedy actually met Frank Johnson on 2 occasions, once in Washington and then down there in Alabama. So they were friends, on more than just a professional level.
Okay. So these were basically a group like the NAACP would sue these southern states, and then the courts would rule, yes, you have to abide by this suit. And then once they failed, it was a contempt of court kind of thing.
Yes. See, what would usually happen is that Bobby Kennedy would lose in the district court, but then he'd go to the Circuit of Appeals, and he'd win in the Circuit of Appeals, the Fifth Circuit. And then the Warren Court would, like 80% of the time, they would back up the Fifth Circuit. And then he would go ahead and be able to either press forward on what he wanted to do, or if he wanted to go ahead and file contempt charges, he could do that also.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to see how that actually works, the mechanics of it.
All right, now, okay, at the end of 62, JFK issued his executive order to integrate housing, but because it was an executive order, it was limited. It wasn't an act of Congress. So I think, if I remember correctly, it only applied to about 15 or 20% of the homes being constructed or remortgaged at that time. All right, and which relates to another criticism of JFK made by Taylor Branch, the biography of King, that King wanted him to issue an order to strike down segregation in the South. Well, on this issue, I got in contact with Professor Erwin Chermaninsky, who was the dean at Cal Berkeley Law School. And I asked him about this. Could Kennedy have done it? And he said, well, he could have, but it would have only applied to the executive branch of government. It wouldn't have applied to private businesses or even state and local governments. And since Kennedy was already doing that, through affirmative action, that criticism is completely unfounded. Now, Kennedy does submit an omnibus civil rights bill in February of 1963, all right? And he made an address upon its issuance, citing that, this is the right thing to do. There's a moral dimension to that speech he gave, which we've linked to here. And what happened was that for the first time, this bill had a chance to make it through because of several events that made the whole civil rights issue front page news. And that, of course, was the Birmingham demonstrations, plus Kennedy's face-off with George Wallace at the University of Alabama. All right? Now, at Birmingham, by the way, Birmingham was not, as most people think, that wasn't King's idea, and neither was it the SCLC's idea. One of the things I tried to do in this series of essays was to show that this whole thing was a much more complex phenomenon than most people. The media and the academia try and boil it down to one, two, or three people, or two or three. It was much more complex than that. See, Fred Shuttlesworth was the guy who started those demonstrations, all right? And he had to push this SCLC King's group into joining him. And it was James Bevel, another guy who gets almost no credit, who provided the brilliant stroke that turned that around. Because by the beginning of May, all right, the thing was dying down. King couldn't get enough people in the streets. So Bevel thought of the idea of getting little children, all right, and while King was out of town, he rehearsed the kids, and he told them that I'm going to be on the radio on May the 2nd. I'll issue a code word. You listen for that code word. When the code word gets broadcast, you begin to march out of the church. Mm. And that's how it happened. It was really James Bevel, who's a brilliant idea, all right? And so that's how you got, of course, everybody's familiar with the famous pictures of the fire department with those high-powered hoses, knocking little kids off the wall, and, rabid German Shepherd dogs, going after men, women, and children in the streets of Birmingham. And so after the second day of this, the CEO of the local newspaper, Vincent Townsend, calls a friend of his at the sheriff's office and says, call the Justice Department. We need to get Burke Marshall down here. This is enough. And so that's what started the settlement. Okay? Now, JFK and RFK now decided this is the moment for us to really go ahead and eliminate Jim Crow in the South. All right? And in fact, JFK called up Dick Gregory, the famous comedian who just passed away a few months ago, right?
Yeah, recently.
Yeah, just a few months ago. And he said, Dick, I need to know everything that happened in Birmingham. I'm probably not getting the full story from these news reports. And so Gregory told him, and he said the whole thing. It's about 10, 12 minutes. And JFK said to Gregory, when he was done, he said, we got those bastards now. Mm. All right? And this is when he decided to overhaul the bill, making it much stronger. And then he begins a tremendous lobbying effort. For about 1 month between May and June, he flew in all of these local power centers from different cities and different states, mayors, governors, lawyers, business leaders, and most important of all, clergy. All right? And when it was all over, JFK had brought in about 1,600 people. And those people created spin-off groups back home. And it was that spin-off group, according to Richard Russell, who was running, one of the three people running the Southern filibuster, that broke it open. He said, we'd been able to hold the line until all the churches joined the civil rights lobby in 1964. All right? And so that's how the bill passed. All right? It wasn't LBJ. That's a myth, which the MSM has brought up, and Robert Caro has tried to extend in his crappy book, The Passage of Power, and because a guy named Clay Ryson wrote a very good book about this called The Bill of the Century. He said Johnson might have turned over one vote, okay, and he said King had very little or nothing to do with it either. The most important people were Hubert Humphrey, Bobby Kennedy and his Justice Department team, most notably Burke Marshall and Nicholas Katzenbach, and the Republican Senator Thomas Kuchel. All right. Now, the March on Washington, that was the idea of Bayard Rustin and Philip Randolph. And I think Randolph wanted to do this because both Roosevelt and with Truman, he had backed down when he got a few morsels from them, like the FEPC and integrating the military. And so he decided to go ahead and organize this thing for the civil rights, an omnibus civil rights bill. And Kennedy, some people have written, that somehow, and King actually spread this, that somehow Kennedy was against the demonstration. No, he wasn't. What he was against was the first draft put together by Bayard Rustin, because that called for a 2-day civil disobedience demonstration centered on Capitol Hill. And JFK did not think that was a very good idea. It's too confrontational. That's not the kind of attention you want to get. And so Kennedy managed to get about 4 of his people, including Walter Reuther, on the organizing committee. And so that's how it was evolved to the great, great success that it was, okay, which I think everybody would acknowledge. That was probably one of the high points of liberalism, post-World War II, the Great March on Washington, all right? And the reason Kennedy didn't speak at the demonstration is not that he didn't want to, is that they didn't want him to speak. Bayard Rustin wanted this to be their time in the sun. He wanted the accent to be on the civil rights leaders. And so him and Roy Wilkins put together this excuse saying that they feared for Kennedy's life, and then they would meet him afterwards at the White House. Okay, and so that's how that happened. All right. Now JFK understood that there was a lot riding on this civil rights bill because he had now become hated in the South. All right, but he and his brother and Humphrey decided that this was going to be it. All right. Well, when the bill first went up, it only had 42 votes, not even half the Senate after it got through the House of Representatives. All right. But through a relentless full court press, all right, and plus now there began to be a push by church people on Midwest Republicans, all right, they finally managed to make it through. It took 1 year to pass the bill. And so as I've written here, no president before Kennedy ever confronted the civil rights issue as he did. Nobody was even close. And he did it from literally the very first day. Carl Brower, who wrote a very good book on this, said what Kennedy did is he picked up the narrow trail that Truman had tried to forge, and he broadened it into wide avenues. And at the end of this part 3, I make a chart showing the achievements of FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, and JFK. JFK has them all beat. It's basically it's a mismatch.
Right.
And by the way, he did it in 3 years. FDR was in office for 13, Truman for 7, Eisenhower for 8, and JFK, had something like 7 times as many achievements in 1/3 of the time. That's how significant it is. So I hope this is a corrective to what, all the baloney that's out there about the Kennedys being slow and not achieving much in civil rights.
This is Our Hidden History